friends at home and abroad. Welcome once again to another on our series, Straight Talk. The topic we are going to be discussing this week has to do with the 27th anniversary of October 5th, 1992. We will be reflecting on October the 5th, 92. The year which brought the dawn of a new era to Guyana. Why do we want to reflect on this occasion, on this particular date and on this particular year? The fact of the matter is that October 5, 1992 opened up new vistas for the democratic process in Guyana. Had it not been for October the 5th, 92, a lot of what transpired in our country over the past years would not have been realizable or possible. Even in today's context, many of the events that are taking place have their genesis in October 5th, 1992. We pay special attention to this particular date and year precisely because it means so much in terms of the history of our country's political evolution. Many may ask the question, why go back so many years, 27 years? But you know, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. Many have asked, why not go forward instead of going backward 27 years? Well, many of us lived through that period, and it behoves those of us who lived through that period and who witnessed the events through that period up to the time when the PPP won the first democratically elected government in this country in a post-independent period. It behoves us to talk about these events. This is not to say that we are not being relevant in the context of today's situation, politically, economically, and socially. But in order to understand where we are today, it is important that we understand and appreciate where we came from. After all, what is playing out today in our country has a historical antecedents in what occurred in the past. And in order to understand what is happening now in our country, we need to go back to appreciate what took place in the past. Precisely because what the Granger administration, or the caretaker government as we call it, is doing now has happened before. And we will come to that as we proceed. Now, when we say that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, we are obviously talking about mistakes of the past. It is important that we think and reflect on the mistakes of the past in order that we do not repeat them. And we make mistakes as individuals, as institutions, as countries, as well as governments and parties in and out of government. You know, no one can expect a perfect government or a perfect political party. What we do expect, however, is that the promises that are made by the party that is seeking office, that those promises are fulfilled and that those promises are to the general satisfaction of the broad majority of people, the working people, the farmers, the intellectuals, the professionals, the businessmen, everyone in the country ought to benefit from the policies of any government or any party that is seeking to occupy the seats of government. Mistakes have been made in the past, and mistakes are being made now by the minority Granger administration or the caretaker administration of the APNU AFC. But let us deal for a brief while with the 3 periods which the PPP was in office prior to 1992. Those 3 periods which the PPP held office, first of all, was for 133 days in 1953. The PPP had won the elections in 1953, and that government initiated a number of reforms in almost every sector of our country's social, economic, and political life. Reforms were implemented in the educational, in the health, in the social services, and in the agricultural sector as well. But these reforms were short-lived, because in 1955, for fear that the PPP was going to establish a communist government, the constitution was suspended by the British, the colonial office, resulting in the PPP being in office for only 133 days. But elections were called again 4 years after, in 1957. And once again, the PPP won those elections. The PPP administered the country as a colony from 1957 to 1964. Dr. Cheddi Jagan was the premier of the country at the time. He led a very powerful cabinet of very able and experienced persons. Some fantastic reforms were carried out once more in the key sectors of the country's economy. Dr. Jagan himself took the portfolio of Minister of Industry because he believed that industrialization, minimal as it could be, would result in the increase in Guyana's ability to export products, manufacturing sector, and that is precisely why he established the industrial site at Rambell, allowing local businessmen to establish industries at a location where all of them would be located to produce local products. So the reform that took place in 1957 to 1964, for example, in the agriculture sector, where you had establishment of pollers such as the Blackbush Poller, Canals Poller, Banwaksari, and many other parts of Guyana, resulted in the fantastic blossoming of the agricultural sector and production of agricultural products, to the extent that Guyana became known as the breadbasket of the Caribbean. Food was in abundance, and especially locally produced foods. Those that could not be produced locally were imported with a limited amount of foreign exchange that the government had at the time at its disposal. But in 1962, with independence talks already beginning in London, problems began to develop and assumed not only a political bias but also a racial bias. We had riots, we had disturbances, we had ethnic conflicts. The CIA and the British fomented problems in this country to the extent that it was declared that the PPP would be unable to govern the country after independence. And therefore, machinations took place in order to allow the coalition government created by the PNC and the United Force to administer the affairs of our country. In 1966, independence was granted to Guyana. The achievements of this period are too numerous to mention. In the same way that when the PPP won the elections on October 5th, 1992, the achievements in that period from 92 to 2050 are exhaustive if not exhausting, to mention. But we do not want to recite all the achievements that were made by the PPPC governments during that period. One question I think which many people would ask is, how is it that the PPP was able to win the elections in 1953, 1957 and 1992? The answer to that is quite simple. In 1953, it was the PPP that raised a whole host of questions pertaining to our country's independence. The PPP also demanded internal self-government in 1953, apart from talking about independence. And the PPP advanced a call for a number of reforms in key sectors of our country's social, economic, and political life. Those calls resonated quite well with the people of the country at the time. And it was as a result of that that the party in 1953 won those elections. The same occurred in 1957. Notwithstanding the fact that the Constitution had been suspended and many of the leaders restricted to certain parts of the country, when elections were called in 1957, the people rallied once again to the call and re-elected the PPP to office. By that time, the party was split. Mr. Burnham, who was one of the founders of the PPP, went his way and created the People's National Congress. And notwithstanding the fact that the PPP was split in 1955, when elections were called in 1957, the PPP won the overwhelming majority of votes, 18 out of 64 seats. Now, the first time in 1953, the PPP ruled for 133 days. On the second occasion in 1957 to 64, 7 years. And from 92 to 2015, 23 years. That period was the longest in the history of the PPP in government. How was it that the PPP was able to rule for 23 years, from 92 to 2015? First and foremost, this was because there was free and fair elections every single time elections were held throughout that period. There was never ever any controversy, save and except the one or two occasions which the PNC wanted to create problems without any substance whatsoever. This occurred, for example, in 1997 when Mrs. Janet Jagan won the presidency. And we all know what took place during that time. Mr. Hoyt, who was the opposition leader at the time, came out and said quite bluntly that this country does not wish to have a white American Jewish woman being the president of Guyana. That statement by its very nature was racist and totally unacceptable in a country where racism plays a very important role in stirring the emotions of people. And so Mrs. Jagan, as a result of compromise struck, had to reduce her term by 2 years, with elections being called in 2006. But the fact of the matter is, notwithstanding all these machinations and attempts to remove the PPP from office, the PPP administered the country for 23 years, first and foremost because of free and fair elections, precisely because of the democratic atmosphere that was created in the country. People felt more free, people felt a great degree of freedom and ability to do as they wish within the meaning of the Constitution and the laws of Guyana. Business became very vibrant. the economy expanded. Agriculture went to very high limits. And almost every sector of the country, especially the social sector, that happened because Dr. Jagan committed himself to spending more money on health and education. The PPP-C government struggled on. And by the time 2015 arrived, some developments had taken place in the country which created tremendous amount of challenges for a party that was in government for 23 years. But the fact of the matter is that we went to the polls in 2015 at a free and fair elections and lost. Suffice it to say that it's rather ironic that it's the same atmosphere of democracy and free and fair election that was created in 1992 that resulted in the APNU AFC number 1 being created and number 2 in the APNU AFC winning the elections in 2015. That is rather ironic, but that is the price you pay for establishing a democracy and having free and fair elections. So the achievements have been in many ways. Constitutional reforms, reforms in the parliament, reforms in the financial architecture, reforms in the economy, reforms in the educational sector, in the health sector, in foreign affairs, and so forth. And incidentally, let me again mention a fact that is sometimes being distorted. Before Dr. Jagan assumed office as president of the country in 1992, during the campaign, he made a promise that more money will be spent on health and education and the security forces. Because when he examined the budgetary allocations for those sectors, he found that they were woefully under budgeted. So during the campaign, he made a promise that the budget allocated for foreign affairs, allocated for the office of the president, and allocated to other sectors that were not so deserving, or other ministries that were so not deserving, will be reduced significantly. In fulfillment of that promise, Dr. Jagan sent me on a mission to all the diplomatic missions, embassies, high commissions, and consul generals in various parts of the world. My task was to make recommendations to reduce the staff in order to bring it under greater scrutiny by central government at home, and also to ensure that the budgetary allocation, as he had promised, to foreign affairs was not as bloated as it used to be. That task was accomplished. And so when many people say that Clement Rohi, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, cut the budget and dismissed people of a particular ethnicity at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs' missions abroad, I did so under the clear and unequivocal direction of the government of the day, and on the basis of the campaign promises that were made by Dr. Jagan before he became president, and on the assumption to the office of the president. We lost elections during those 3 periods, or lost office, I should say, during those 3 periods for different reasons. In 1953, because the Constitution was suspended. In 1964, because of the racial riot, disturbances, and all kinds of problems that was created by outside forces. And in 2015, precisely because, having been in government for 23 years, problems developed among our supporters, some of whom were encouraged by the AFC to move away from the PPP because promises were made to them that were never ever fulfilled to this day. Also, there was some degree of complacency on the part of the party in terms of doing more political work as it should have done being in government. The lesson from that is that no party must negate or must neglect doing its political work even while it is in government. This is an extremely difficult task to balance the two. How to fulfill your governmental and ministerial responsibilities while at the same time doing your political work. Let us not fool ourselves. Government work is not necessarily party political work, and party political work is not necessarily government work. The two has to be conducted separately. And that was the experience of all three phases with the PPP, during which the PPP held office. Now we come to the period which we're in at this point in time. As I said, we have to be careful that we do not repeat mistakes of the past. We have now been experiencing many of the experiences we had in the past elections. Right now, a lot of people in Guyana and outside Guyana are asking the question as to whether the election will be rigged. This issue is on the lips of almost every Guyanese. Not that they are expecting to lose the elections, that is to say, supporters of the opposition. But while they are fully behind the opposition, PPP and others, for a free and fair elections, lingering at the back of their heads is the experiences they've had with the PNC of rigging elections. But it's not only those experiences, it's the track record that is now being followed or have been established by the APNU AFC of wanting to hold on to government, notwithstanding the no confidence motion that was passed in the Parliament on December 21st, 2014. It is clear to each and every Guyanese that the government had resorted to the courts using all kind of frivolous reasons why they should go to the courts in order to extend and buy time in order to remain in office. The point that I want to make is that history has a way of repeating itself. And we have to learn from those historical experiences. In the same way that we fought against rigged elections and for free and fair elections, we are again engaged 27 years after in that same fight. This is rather interesting, if not disappointing. The PNC in office through the APNU AFC has never really won a free and fair election. And they know that this time around, it's not only a question of a free and fair elections, it's a question of the track record that they've established from the very beginning of not paying attention to the needs, to the cries of the people. Totally ignoring the ordinary man, the ordinary working woman and working man and their needs. And doing everything to feather their nests, to fill their pockets, and to put themselves in good stead for the future. This is what their track record is all about. High degrees of corruption, squandermania, and nepotism has taken place. And so, when we examine all that is taking place in relation to the preparation for elections, some people, many of us are clearly discerning the possibility of the government resorting to fraudulent means in order to maintain themselves in office. Right now, or I should say in the coming weeks, there will be a big fight over this question of the list. This has been the case before in 1992, between 1990 and 92, where the list was so corrupted it had to be thrown out and produced afresh. But that resulted in the government being given another 2 years of being in government, or the PNC being given another 2 years to be in the government. In other words, the elections had to be postponed. And the question is, are we looking at such a possibility once again? Because if this voters list is corrupted with the merging of the information or the data gathered from the recent house to house and the current National Register of Registrants from which the voters list ought to be developed, we will bound to have a list that is totally unacceptable and rejected by the opposition forces. What will happen thereafter is a possibility of a return to what we experienced prior to the elections in 1992. A totally corrupted and unacceptable list which will have to be rejected by the opposition, and who knows, question might be a new list being produced, an election being postponed. Now, this is not something that we would like to see. This is not something that we're hoping for. This is not something we're wishing for. But at every stage of the process, a struggle has to be waged. And not only 2 eyes, but even 3 or 4 eyes have to be put in place to ensure that a free and fair elections, or the steps to produce a free and fair elections, are in place. This brings us to the question of outside interference, what the government calls interference, but what we call outside help and outside assistance to make sure that the elections are conducted freely and fairly. This is not the first time senators, congressmen, international organizations such as the OAS, the Commonwealth, or even the United Nations for that matter, has pronounced on the need for free and fair elections in Guyana. It has happened in the past, prior to 1992. These institutions call on the Hoyt administration to conduct free and fair elections in Guyana. Even the Caribbean community, CARICOM, pressured Hoyt to hold free and fair elections. And that is why many people find it strange that on this occasion, CARICOM is very silent on what is taking place in Guyana. Some talk about quiet diplomacy. We have no problem with quiet diplomacy. I personally, as a former foreign minister, have no problem whatsoever with quiet diplomacy. But in this particular instance, this diplomacy must be made known to the people, because it is a constitutional right of the people to know what is going on, and for the people to have the right to elect a government of their choice. So while quiet diplomacy is important, what is important equally is for the people to be informed about the steps that are being taken by CARICOM to ensure that Guyana does not become a pariah state among the other member states of CARICOM. Now, in the same way that we have what is called just and unjust wars, in the same way we have just and unjust interference or help or assistance to countries. In Vietnam, the Vietnamese waged what was called a just war in the fight against fascism. Many countries waged a just war to defeat fascism. And this has been the experience at the global level. You have unjust interference and just interference. Unjust interference took place in Guyana in 53 and 57. Unjust interference took place in 53 when the British suspended the Constitution. Unjust interference took place in 1957 with the CIA and the British intervening in Guyana to remove the PPP from office. The PNC might want to call what is happening now unjust interference, because they want to conduct themselves in a way that is contrary to the Constitution, and they want to conduct elections to achieve fraudulent ends to keep themselves in office. For them, that is unjust interference. But for us, the interference is just because it is for a just cause, meaning a cause that will deliver the people their constitutional right to elect a government of their choice by way of free and fair elections. My friends, all that I've said, all of these developments that I've referred to, all of these events flow from what took place on October the 5th, 1992. And that is why when we describe October the 5th, 1992 as a watershed of the events that flowed from then to now, that date, by its very nature, develops and depicts all the events that took place in our country up to now. October the 5th, 1992 was what I would describe as the harbinger of subsequent events that flowed through our country, whether it's through the democratic means, economic, political, and social, up to the time that we are at this point in time. So, in reflecting on October the 5th, 1992, which we will be celebrating this year, because this recording is being made on October the 4th. Tomorrow will be October the 5th, when we commemorate the victory of the PPPC at the 1992 elections, which brought the dawn for a new era in Guyana, which dawn some are seeking to reverse back to the pre-1990 era, something that we could never accept and something that we will always reject. Because all of the achievements, all that we have accomplished from 1992 to today ought not to be washed away, ought not to be erased as a result of a corrupt caretaker government wanted to take Guyana back to the dark days which this country lived through prior to the elections on October 5th, 1992. Our task, therefore, the best commitment that we can make on the eve of the elections to be held in March next year, is to work as best as we could to put our shoulders to the wheel, to make whatever modest contribution we can make in order to avoid, in order to prevent the reversal of all the gains Guyana has had since October 5th, 1992. We look forward to your support. We look forward to the support of every Guyanese in Guyana and outside of Guyana to ensure that the gains of October 92 remains steadfast, remains intact, and that come the elections in March of next year, we take up from where we left off and proceed with making Guyana once again a prosperous, peaceful, and progressive country. Thank you, my friends. Until next time, let us look forward to the conversation on Straight Talk. Goodbye.